Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 46th week of 2015. I'm Carl Estabrook. For 25 years, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, but I was deplatformed there. Deplatforming is a recent coinage in university and media. It means depriving someone of a place to speak because of what they're saying. There's a famous case of that resolved this week, apparently, in Champaign-Urbana. But I appreciate the chance to come to you now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green, Ron Zoke, and I will try to say some true things. It's November 13th. On this day in 1969, anti-Vietnam War protesters in Washington, D.C. staged a March Against Death. In Washington, as a prelude to the second moratorium against the war scheduled for the following weekend, protesters marched beginning at 6 a.m. And drew over 45,000 participants, each with a placard bearing the name of a soldier who had died in Vietnam. Now, this, remember, was 1969. By the end of the 60s, a majority of Americans not only opposed the war that the U.S. was carrying on in Southeast Asia, but came to think the war was not a mistake, but a crime. That sort of that level of opposition, I think, has not been reached in regard to the Southwest Asian wars, which have gone on much longer, of course, in the last dozen years and more. But in 1969, the public sentiment was substantial, as this march showed. The significance of that public sentiment is, in a sense, more arguable. The marchers on this day in '69 began in Arlington National Cemetery and continued past the White House, where they called out the names of the dead. The march lasted 2 days and 2 nights. The demonstration and the moratorium that followed did not produce a change in official policy. President Richard Nixon said about the march, quote, "Now I understand that there has been and continues to be opposition to the war in Vietnam on the campuses and also in the nation." Interesting distinction. "As far as this kind of activity is concerned, we expect it," says Nixon. "However, under no circumstances will I be affected whatsoever by it," close quote. That has the extra added advantage, as Nixon's Secretary of State Henry Kissinger would say, of being true. I think they weren't much affected by it, even though the march did represent an overwhelming sentiment in the U.S. populace. What brought the Vietnam War to an end was not the popular disapproval, but rather the revolt of the expeditionary force that the U.S. had sent to Vietnam. The army of draftees finally refused to fight. It's not really got its way into the official history, but that was the circumstance that led to the sudden withdrawal of U.S. ground forces 4 years later, and the eventual withdrawal of American military support in general to its puppet government in South Vietnam. The lines this brings to mind come from Edward de Vere's play As You Like It. "Sweet are the uses of adversity, which like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head. And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything." Now, it seems to me that there are ways in which the anti-war movement of 2 generations ago is looked at as those lines suggest. I think, in fact, the uses of adversity were sweet to the Nixon administration and to later American administrations, which were able, in some sense, to co-opt it and say that, well, look, the problem was that there was this vast anti-war movement that changed American policy for the worse. That certainly has been the line in recent American politics. It was George Bush Sr. who said after the first Gulf War, we have finally got rid of the Vietnam syndrome. Well, that's what we were watching being constructed in the late 1960s. So you're watching News from Neptune, a Sweet Are the Uses of Adversity edition. I think we'll get around to the notion that sweet also perhaps are the uses of diversity. We'll see. But we'll begin with David Green.
Yeah, I'm going to try to contextualize some of these university-related issues, and I think that leads quite nicely into the question that Carl just raised as to when people protest, who cares?
Yes.
And what is it that actually gets the 1% to care about what the people think? I don't see anything going on right now that's really getting the 1% to care a whole lot about what people think, and this is the problem. We're confronted with the case of Steven Saleta, of course, and we're confronted with that in the context of what's being called a rebellion in universities around the country, perhaps a little bit overstated,
yes,
and for reasons which I would like to contextualize. I've been meaning to refer to a writer, an English professor, not a full English professor, but I think an adjunct or yearly hire at Purdue, who's gotten some notoriety recently, named Frederick de Boer, small d-e, capital B-O-E-R, who had an article in the New York Times Magazine on this past September 9th. And I also heard him interviewed, which is the reason I found out about this, on a nice podcast I've been listening to called Unauthorized Disclosure with Rania Khalek and Kevin Gostola. And just to quote a couple of paragraphs, a couple of somewhat, may sound a little bit disjointed, but they're from the same long article by Frederick de Boer, the article is entitled "Against the Corporate Taming of," or why we should fear University Inc. against the corporate taming of the American college. And this first little snippet I read is about the rise of the administrative class in this context. He refers to a constantly expanding layer of university administrative jobs now exists at an increasing remove from the actual academic enterprise. It's not unheard of for colleges now to employ more senior administrators than professors. There are, of course, essential functions that many university administrators perform, but such an imbalance is absurd. Try imagining a high school with more vice principals than teachers. This legion of bureaucrats enables a world of pitiless surveillance. No segment of campus life, no matter how small, does not have some administrator who worries about it. Piece by piece, every corner of the average campus is being slowly made congruent with a single totalizing vision. The rise of endless brushed metal and gas buildings at Purdue represents the aesthetic dimension of this ideology. Bent into place by a small army of apparatchiks, the contemporary American college is slowly becoming as meticulously art-directed and branded as a J. Crew catalog. Like Nike Town or Disney World, your average college campus now leaves the distinct impression of a one-party state. And more apropos to the current rebellion, the nature of the rebellion on college campuses, which seems directed partly at identity politics and partly at getting administrators fired, neither of which and certainly is referring to student debt. I'm not putting down the passion of these students and the fact that they themselves probably sense extreme underlying problems here. But I think why the De Boer article is so important is that he talks about how student protest is co-opted by the manner in which universities function. And again, later on in the same article, he writes, if students have adopted a litigious approach to regulating campus life, they are only working within the culture that colleges have built for them. Mm-hmm. When your environment so deeply resembles a Fortune 500 company, it makes sense to take every contingent complaint straight to HR, meaning human resources. I don't excuse students who so zealously pursue their vision of campus life that they file Title IX complaints against people whose opinions they don't like. But I recognize their behavior as a rational response within a bureaucracy. It's hard to blame people within a system, particularly people so young, who take advantage of structures they've been told exist to help them. The problem is that these structures exist for the institutions themselves, and thus the erosion of political freedom is ultimately a consequence of the institutions. When we identify students as the real threat to intellectual freedom on campus, we're almost always looking in the wrong place. And I'll conclude here with this last brief paragraph from this article, Why We Should Fear University, Inc. Frederick De Boer writes, I wish that committed student activists would recognize that the administrators who run their universities, no matter how convenient a recipient of their appeals, are not their friends. I want these bright, passionate students to remember that the best legacy of student activism lies in shaking up administrators, not in making appeals to them. At its worst, this tendency results in something like collusion between activists and administrators. Directed at the University of Illinois students who supported Stephen Salaita's effort to get his job back, Chancellor Barbara Wilson is not your friend. Okay, she has stepped in for Phyllis Wise to do what Phyllis Wise couldn't do because she started with this problem. And a lot of times when you start with the problem, you can't finish it. They had to get a different but same person in there to finish the problem. And the problem was finished by paying him a lot of money, which is water off a duck's back in terms of the finances of the corporate university. Barbara Wilson is no worse or better a person than Phyllis Wise was, nor any of the other administrators involved in this repression of freedom of speech and this violation, this blatant violation of firing someone who had been given a job and been told that he would have to already been told that he was required to show up and teach a year ago, August. This isn't criticism of Stephen Salaita in terms of the choice he and his lawyers made to accept this settlement without accepting getting his job back, whether he should have gotten his job back or he should have gotten a settlement that was much larger. As I recall Norman Finkelstein saying when he was going through similar litigious processes after being denied tenure at DePaul, in Chicago, he said no one could put themselves in the shoes of someone who's under the stresses of being a part of a legal process like this. So Stephen Salaita, I think it made it clear. I think Corey Robin on his blog expressed similar sentiments. But regardless of that, this certainly is not a victory for free speech. Obviously, not a victory for free speech on this campus. The fundamental issues that students around the country are quite rightly rebelling against, if that's the proper word, or at least resisting, or at least protesting, or at least complaining about. These things have underlying causes, not just in student debt, although that gets close to an underlying cause as it speaks to the neoliberal origins of the manner in which college is being paid for at this time. But to conclude, these things are all related. I don't sense that we're making a whole lot of progress. I don't sense that it's November 13th, and Thanksgiving is in 2 weeks, and I fear that by the time Christmas break comes around, this is all going to be ancient history in terms of any real effect on the educational political life of this country.
Thank you, David. That's important and ties together, it seems to me, quite properly, a variety of things that are going on at the little university down the street and the university, the neoliberal university in general across the country. You're watching News from Neptune. You got a take on this, Ron?
Yeah, well, I started calling it the messed up university based on the words of former top administrator. It's a matter, I think, of the larger theme. You keep hearing the university should be run like a business. And that is so wrong. It's hard to know where to start. But the model of the corporation, a business corporation, and the students are cast as the consumers, and they have employees. And this keeps coming up in the letters about the Salida case in the local newspaper, that in business he would have been fired for saying things that displeased top management. And again, the model is there. That's the only thing they can think of to legitimate their thoughts, is to what extent is it like a for-profit business. And it's just amazing that people cannot break out of that kind of mindset. The business of free speech, I've long thought that this became a value after the transformation, capitalist transformation of the 17th and 18th century, especially, when what people said no longer made any difference. What was important was money making. And you're free to say anything you like, well, within certain limits, as long as it doesn't interfere with money making. And that's how we acquired the notion of freedom of speech. Before that, it was a matter of saving your eternal soul if you said certain kinds of things that would bring discredit upon the institution and so on. But when that no longer matters, no one really believes that stuff anymore. Say anything, almost anything you like, because it's all going to be ignored anyway. And we have this phenomenon then of people saying more and more outrageous and absurd things in order to get attention, such as, well, certain right-wing commentators. And
Not us.
yeah, right. And people start killing other people in order to get attention, like the Unabomber and the guy in Norway who complained that people weren't listening to him about his complaints about all the foreigners entering Norway and so on. So he gunned down, what was it, 70-some of them.
Yes.
And so to get them to listen and to take him seriously. And so a lot of people are feeling that way. At the same time, there's this, well, on a larger scale, this thing that's been noticed since the 1930s, a lot of political conflict is cast in the mold of capitalism versus socialism. And a number of people, starting with James Burnham, and then George Orwell picked up on this and so on. What we're coming up with is something intermediate, actually, called managerialism. Capitalism can survive in its classical form, cannot survive because of the social disruption that comes about under capitalist institutions. And so they have to keep adopting little pieces of socialism and resulting in a mixed economy, which is supposed to be especially virtuous. So there's still room for the entrepreneurs, and there are enough welfare measures to keep the general populace pacified. The question is, are we reaching a boiling point of the uprising of the fast food workers, the students on the campuses, and so on? Will these, to some extent, convergent, I hope, movements result in any real institutional change. And to this point, I don't think so. Will this become intense enough to attract the attention of the plutocracy, the 1%, and so on? And they have various ways of pacifying it, and so on, which have been very effective thus far. And whether it will lead to a significant disruption, I'm not sure. The main control device, of course, being propaganda and telling these people that you're not being realistic, and your student loans are going to come due soon, and you better think about establishing a career. So we have more and more ex-students, particularly young women with a college degree, going home and live with their parents. About a third of them seem to be doing that these days. They are well trained in the consumerist ideology. Benjamin Barber, the political sociologist, has written a good deal about this in his book, Consumed. Their role in society is to have a prosperous career, make enough money so they can buy stuff. And he blames advertising, or the kind of advertising we have anyway, for this notion that you owe it all to yourself. And what's important is your feelings about things, in particular your feelings about all of the goodies and gadgets and merchandise that you should have. And if that's being kept from you by society, then you're victimized, and you should engage in a lot of self-pity about how you're being oppressed and victimized. But anyway, again, there's a larger theme here of the bias toward subjectivism and narcissism, which has been noticed by a number of commentators and pundits and so on. The notion that it's all about me, and if people say bad things, I have a right to, to complain to the authorities first and demand that these people who are saying things that trigger my anxieties and make me upset be punished. And the extreme version of this, of course, is that if someone's presence makes me feel threatened or unsafe, it's my right to kill them.
But you know, Jim Dye wrote a column a week or two ago about people being so sensitive about having their feelings hurt.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when it comes to Stephen Salaita saying things that upset people,
Right.
Jim Dye said off with his head.
Yeah, right.
And ridiculed him. So there's a basic lack of consistency.
Yes.
And on an understanding what is the origin of this, what's being called political, what has been called political correctness on college campuses or in the society at large. Is it the leftist radicals left over from the 1960s who are doing that? Well, insofar as some of them have engaged in identity politics, they have been the source of some repression and some hypersensitivity on college campuses and elsewhere. Although there's a certain amount of civility that should be involved in discussing important things, but this idea that Bill Ayers, James Kilgore, and Stephen Salaita represent, along with a lot of other unnamed people, mainly because they don't exist in any serious way, the idea that they are responsible for repressing the voices of others while at the same time being a threat with violence. I mean, this is a confusion that is sown by, yes, people of the right, like Jim Dye, but people of the left have to, on the one hand, be honest about what the wages of identity politics have been in the context of the corporate university, and on the other hand, what it is real repression of leftist, whatever little bit of leftist dissidence there might be, namely someone like Steven Saleta coming along and saying that he doesn't like Americans supporting Israel, killing children in Gaza and occupying the West Bank, which is a topic in all of this that seems to be hard. It's hard to get to, and that was the whole point. The point is that Barbara Wilson doesn't want us to talk about these things. The point is that Chancellor Barbara Wilson, has to go along with this corporate institution that she now heads, which supports American foreign policy by default, which supports Israel's occupation of Palestine by default, which supports all of the relationships that American businesses have with Israel in terms of high tech and weaponry by default. This can't be talked about.
Yeah. Remember her first and proudest comment on this Saleta case was that the administration never even considered. They never thought about giving Saleta his job.
That was a horribly
Yeah.
arrogant and imperious statement.
The university didn't have to admit that they did anything wrong.
She
Right.
drew the line the minute she
didn't.
took office, and for that reason, she should not be treated any differently by people who genuinely care about this issue. She should not be treated any different than Phyllis Wise, or for that matter, Scott Bennett or Carol Ammons, or the people who could not vote against a measure which the Illinois legislature slapped down those of us, especially those of us on campus, who support the boycott movement.
The aforementioned Jim Dye, opinions editor of the News Gazette, and a friend of this ground in some ways, although we don't find too many areas of
In
agreement.
some very strange ways, yes.
Is probably responsible for the editorial in the News Gazette this morning about the Saleta case. It has his characteristic rhetorical style, and
It's no secret. It's no surprise.
Right.
and gratuitous slaps at the left and dissidents from American foreign policy. But the fact of the matter is that the editorial concludes, I think, correctly. It's typically tendentious in its comment on the Saleta case, and it even manages to justify along the way Israel's 2014 assault on Gaza. But it does arrive at an accurate conclusion. The editorial does arrive at an accurate conclusion, even if it's perhaps not in the way that it means it. The conclusion is the Saleta controversy was the result of a highly unusual set of circumstances not likely to be repeated, close quote. Well, the unusual set of circumstances was that the university hired a scholar who was willing to use his purported academic freedom to condemn official crimes by the U.S. and Israel. Most academics have learnt since Vietnam not to do that. The university in its settlement won in that it manages to make clear that this will not be repeated. The unusual set of circumstances, the actual use of academic freedom on political matters by Steven Saleta is not likely to be repeated, as the editorial says. The university in this settlement wants to make sure that it's not repeated. What new faculty hire, or even old faculty for that matter, at UIUC will now take the chance of condemning Israel-U.S. war crimes? The lesson has been taught, and it only cost the university a third of what it spent on getting rid of an athletic director for cause, even in the face of ineptitude by chancellors and administrators throughout the university. Lesson is learned.
Yeah.
The story is over.
There's so many aspects to this that I would like to comment on, but
Well, I
yeah.
see you brought your comfort items with
Yeah,
you,
right,
Ron.
well,
Maybe
yeah,
you want to go to that, huh?
Right,
I
right.
would,
Well,
I would just have to reiterate that Stephen Saleta, even prior to all of this, in his writing, in his sort of essay form writing, which I find is the most engaging aspects of what he writes, has been critical of exactly the things that Jim Dye is critical of about hypersensitivity in the university, the manner in which administrative procedures take the place of genuine political activism, in the way that multicultural spaces on university campuses are used to repress discourse rather than to heighten things. And obviously at the bottom of all this are the fundamental problems of the university, the corporate university in the neoliberal context, in the class warfare, class struggle context, which is something that I don't have any sense of among the students rebelling at this point in their lives, at this point in time, having grown up for 20 years or however many in this context, whether they can grasp the forces that have shaped their lives, the brutalizing class forces, what can to be called the 1% forces that have shaped their lives and their choices, and that simply cannot be addressed by getting rid of one administrator and replacing them with another one who's exactly the same.
Yes, exactly
And
right.
even if he has a black face, like the current whatever interim president that they've hired at the University of Missouri, with all due respect.
yeah. Well, these
Identity politics triumphant once again. Huh?
these discontents and disruptions can be smothered, they think, by telling the students and other dissenters, you're not following proper procedure. And
The old line is that the genius of liberalism is the ability to turn every question of principle into a question of procedure.
Right.
Once you've done that, you're home free.
But I also want to just pick a little bone with you, Ron, about the origins of free speech. I mean, I realize the Enlightenment, the 18th century Enlightenment, came along with the rise of merchant capitalism and became industrial capitalism in the early 1800s. But freedom of speech, as Noam Chomsky, I think, teaches us, is a profound Enlightenment value related with notions of human freedom that are, that evoke universal values that exist to this day that are worth considering in the libertarian 18th century context in which Chomsky considers it. Wilhelm von Humboldt and German philosophers like that, who are not as well known as the French philosophes and so forth, but we can refer to Voltaire and Rousseau, and these are well worth disentangling from the rise of. Certainly, they've been affected by the rise of capitalism as we know it, but they're well worth recognizing as fundamental values of humanity that's becoming culturally evolved in the proper way.
are you challenging what I said? And that makes me feel insecure.
A microaggression.
Yeah, I'm going to
No,
hold on to my hugging bear here.
I'm just elaborating on what you said in case there was any
But
misunderstanding.
I think you're making a very important point, David, with which I quite agree. It was in a pre-capitalist world that a university professor of the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, he was an Italian, made the remark that whatever is true, no matter by whom spoken, is from the Holy Spirit. So the idea that this can't be true because that sort of person is saying it, or it's been pronounced by that person who we know is a bad person, is pretty far from the notions of free speech that exist far before the rise of capitalism. There are some who suggest that the bourgeois world, the capitalist world, makes speech free only because talk is cheap, only because it doesn't matter, which is, I think, the point that you were making, Ron. And that certainly is not the case for people who take what's being said seriously. Is that true or is it not is a reasonable question. Only the modern world says it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. Those questions are formally undecidable.
These issues seem to reproduce themselves across so many issues.
Yes.
I recall Norman Finkelstein has on many occasions referred to a Holocaust revisionist named David Irving as being a somewhat a respected historian among those who do serious work on the Holocaust,
Right.
because in spite of being a Holocaust revisionist and a denier in some senses, although I'm not sure whether he was a denier in any worse senses than Benjamin Netanyahu recently became.
Yes.
But that aside, the historians acknowledge that the amount of work he did and the amount of things that he unveiled in order to do his ultimately perhaps evil work brought facts to the fore that were not being brought by Holocaust scholars themselves, and that the reasonable ones among them, or the fair ones among them, understand that. And that's why it's so dangerous when you have libel laws, that the kind of laws in England that I think put David Irving into prison for a while for saying things that on the basis of saying things.
Yeah.
And this extends to the notion of hate speech and the whole thing.
Like the French laws against falsifying history,
Yeah.
which
Yes.
brought, what's his name, whom Chomsky wrote about?
Faurisson.
Faurisson,
Yeah.
and another historian, a historian comparable to David Irving.
Yeah, but probably not as good as, quote unquote, good as David Irving. And then David Gehrig, who formerly lived in Urbana and was the prime anti-Holocaust denier, demanded that Carl and I deny him the right to express his views on the Aware Peace listserv. You get crazy things going on. I almost said a bad word. You get crazy stuff going on when people
You got free speech, David.
don't understand the idea that, as Chomsky always says, whoever he's quoting or whether he said it himself, unless you believe in freedom of speech for the speech that you find most vile, to paraphrase, you don't believe in it.
Exactly.
Well, shouldn't we be denouncing that microaggression? I mean, it makes people feel bad.
Well, it's important, I'm a little concerned that there's some people on this campus who take this stuff a little too seriously. This business about trigger warnings and microaggressions, that people aren't to be made to feel uncomfortable. Again, we've made some progress at people treating each other in a civil way, allowing for freedom of speech and treating each other in a civil way. But that doesn't include silencing people who say things that hurt our feelings. I think we can assume in most cases that people don't intend to hurt each other's feelings. They could be nasty. Okay, it's pretty obvious when people are just being nasty. But when they're just being ignorant or stupid, then you respond to them. Then the other cliche, what's become a cliche, the response to bad speech is better speech or more speech.
Yeah.
What I find missing in these current discussions and the debates that we've been referring to this evening is an understanding of the difference between identity politics and class politics. I've argued for a while that identity politics in its modern form, and by modern people of my age mean the last 40 years, identity politics in its modern form was a fallback position of American liberalism when it finally gave up that arc of social democracy that extends from the New Deal through the Great Society of the 60s. American liberals, notably in the Democratic Party, but not exclusively, American liberals had a commitment to a form of class politics that meant an amelioration of the class injuries of modern capitalism. That's what they were there for. That's what grew out of the New Deal. Not very theoretically, it came out of the real understanding of the injuries and injustices, the real injuries and injustices of capitalism in the Great Depression. That arc was countered 40 years ago by the rise of neoliberalism, a conscious policy of American business to turn back the clock on the social supports that the New Deal and its successors had produced. The neoliberal reassertion of the rights of capital over against the social supports that had been put into place led to a generation now of political retrenchment that had one effect, a remarkable disparity between the rich and poor in the United States. Inequality in America has grown substantially since the appearance of neoliberalism in the 1970s, and that was its aim. That's what it set out to do, and it succeeded. It's won. American liberalism, suddenly realizing that its clothes had been stolen while it was in the pool, looked around for some way to reassert its traditions, some way to reassert its virtue, not its tradition, it's given up the tradition from the New Deal, some way to reassert its virtue, and it came up with identity politics. This group or that group suddenly now deserves inclusion in some ways that it was not included before. And the primary result of that, actually, was to alienate a good bit of the American working class who saw Americans of various forms of identity achieving things that they felt had been denied then, or arguing for, perhaps not achieving, things that had been denied them. Adolph Reed, who has written about these matters for a number of years, said in a clotted bit of prose that's worth, I think, disentangling, something that seems to me to be quite right about identity politics. He says, identity politics, in fact, is not really an alternative to class politics. It is a class politics, the politics of the left wing of neoliberalism. It's the expression and active agency of a political order and moral economy in which capitalist market forces are treated as unassailable nature. They've got to be that way. That's neoliberalism for you. But he says identity politics is just a wing of that, or identity politics is a cover for that. An integral element of that moral economy of identity politics is the displacement of the critique of the invidious outcomes produced by capitalist class power into equally naturalized categories of ascriptive identity that sort us into groups supposedly defined by what we essentially are rather than what we do. That is to say, the injuries that I receive from the society are not injuries that accrue to the fact that I have my work stolen from me in order to eat regularly, but because of the fact that I am male or female, white or black, young or old. This question of identity takes the place of my role and function in the society. With this view of society, this view of trying to include the excluded groups, that's the positive way to express it, a society in which 1% of the population controlled 90% of the resources would be just, provided that roughly 12% of the 1% were black, 12% were Latino, 50% were women, and whatever the appropriate proportions were LGBT people. That is the goal, if you like, of identity politics, and the reason that identity politics is simply a gloss on class politics.
Yeah.
It would be tough to imagine a normative ideal that expresses more unambiguously the social position of people who consider themselves candidates for inclusion in, or at least significant staff positions in service to, the ruling class. Identity politics is finally a plea of groups who belong, of individuals who belong to those particular groups, to be included in the generally oppressive structure of class society.
Yes, that's my objection to what I call corporate feminism, for example.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If half of the top executives
Right.
were women, then that would be ideal.
Sure.
But after that's true, and half of the top executives and top people in every field and profession are women, the great majority of women will still have disgusting, low-paid, boring jobs, just the way the great majority of men have always had. And I think that's still a problem. But anyway, yeah, this kind of thinking has a pedigree of at least a century, going back to Arthur Bentley's The Process of Government, when he tried to picture political reality as the conflict of a bunch of pressure groups. That there were all these interest groups that were competing for power, money, influence, and the political process is how they compete with each other, and the distributive system is the result, the output of that struggle of all these different competing groups.
Well, in the lexicon of American politics as it's evolved over the last 50 or 60 years, what that causes me to think is that the white male working class factory worker, whether still working or mostly out of work or mostly just gone, just sort of was reduced in the context of Democratic Party politics, especially, to another interest group, another identity group that was to be, corralled.
Right.
So the Democratic Party, which should be the party, or if we had a proper labor party, would be a party of the working class. Well, the working class aspect of that within the Democratic Party just becomes one identity interest group among feminists, among blacks, among students, or however you want to define them, all in ways that aren't helpful, are not at all helpful to helping us to understand that the vast majority of us are part of the working class.
Yes.
We don't have to have a white face and wear a hard hat in order to do that. And that image was the image of the white working class male who didn't like Vietnam War protesters. That was assiduously cultivated by Nixon.
Yes.
And even though it wasn't really true,
Right.
but it kind of became true in a certain superficial way.
It became
partly because of the way the left and the anti-war movement handled it.
That's certainly true. In fact, both points are important. The first is that at the time of the March Against Death that we started with this evening, that is November of 1969, at that time, opposition to the war in Southeast Asia was, according to very careful social science surveys taken at the time, was opposition to that war was directly proportional to, see, I've got it wrong. The notion was that the opposition to the war was coming from the campuses and so forth, as Nixon said. In fact, support for the war in Southeast Asia was directly proportional to the years of formal education amongst Americans. That is, if you had been to college, you were more likely to support the war, to support the administration's position. This reflected a number of things, including, as David suggested, who was actually dying in that war, that draft army in Vietnam, who among Americans were the casualties of the war. But it was also the notion that this was the reverse of the political mythology that was being assiduously cultivated by the government and by both political parties, I might add, and that the facts in some sense didn't matter because the perception was what took over and still remains in the popular understanding. It was a campus revolt. Certainly the very important things that went on campuses, and the students of that era have, some of the students of that era, after the fact, many of them remembered themselves as being participants in the anti-war movement, who in fact were not at the time, but that's another story. But the participants in that deserve the honor and respect they receive. But it's important to see that the popular opinion in the country was the other way. The mythology that Americans in general were in favor of the war and those college students were against it is just backwards.
In some ways, the stereotype of Archie Bunker was the manner in which the Hollywood writers responded to the threat that the working class opposed the war.
And it became a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways, too,
Yeah, yeah.
as the American imaginary frequently does. That's what Hollywood is all about, eh?
Well, I think you're not taking into account. Usually in a war, when the war drum starts beating and the government is trying to generate some acceptance of it, or maybe even enthusiasm for it, there is a certain enthusiasm for it for a while, but then that quickly dissipates, and people become well, essentially bored with it. I'm not sure they ever realize what it's doing to the society as a whole, or to them in person. But anyway, yeah, people do quickly become disillusioned with it. But I think you can't ignore the initial stage of enthusiasm for it.
This enthusiasm is carefully built up, of course. I mean,
Yes,
that's what the
yes.
governments are busily doing. The greatest propaganda system the world has ever seen, of course, is the American government, and that's a conscious development of the last century.
Yeah.
Really, the origins are to be sought in the First World War, when the government wanted the U.S. to be involved in a European war, and the vast majority of Americans didn't want the U.S. to be involved in that war, so much so that the Democratic president running for re-election in 1916 took as his motto, "He kept us out of war." This is the way he sold his re-election to the American people. This is Woodrow Wilson. Immediately he was re-elected, of course, he connived to get the U.S. into the war, because this was the interest primarily of American financial leaders who saw the war as good for business. And what we would now call the defense industries, that is the weapons makers, went quite along with them. And these are the people that Wilson was working for. But his job was to change this conception, this understanding, this profound anti-war sentiment within the United States. And as Ron has talked about here before, he got some of the leading intellectuals of early 20th century America to work on something that was a propaganda organ called the Creel Commission in order to produce that transformation. It worked.
Yeah. This is strongly correlated with the rise of the mass media, starting with the newspapers around shortly after 1900. The government quickly gets the cooperation of certain influential publishers, such as Hearst, and then we're off and running.
And once again, the poets get there first. The best account you have of this, I think, is in Gore Vidal's novel of the 1890s, The Golden Age. That it doesn't find its way so much into the history books themselves. But it seems to me that this is an example of the way in which the popular mind has to be formed in favor of war against America. We've got to remember the greatest anti-war demonstrations in history, the greatest, in terms of the number of participants, the greatest anti-war demonstrations in history in the U.S. and elsewhere occurred in 2003, before the American invasion of Iraq. The idea that America rose up and went off to punish these vicious Middle Eastern dictators is the formation of pusillanimous historians writing about it after the fact because they have comfortable university jobs in part.
Yeah, well, there were a number of other people running around saying the government must know something that we don't.
Well, unfortunately,
President
technology,
is smarter than you are.
Right,
I'd say,
right.
yes, yeah.
unfortunately, technology isn't going to save us. Even in spite of the fact that three guys like us get to come into this little studio and be on YouTube, where theoretically anybody on Earth could hear us talk, we all know it doesn't work that way. We all know that the internet is a contested site, as they say, as it is corporatized, as the whole look of it changes as we go around and constantly find ourselves propagandized to and advertised to and marketed to and fished for and all that kind of stuff. It's still, and this is, speaking to ourselves, speaking to our friends here, speaking to college students, that it will take organized and massive protest. It will take serious serious demands made on the basis of elevated class consciousness and understanding of how this neoliberal system really works and what the pillars of it really are, in order for us to begin to be able to say that we're using our media and that we're using our technology in a way that that creates what could be called political progress.
Do you think the fast food workers and the college students will be able to unite on any significant?
Well, I think that the college students are increasingly understanding that the workers on their campuses are like oppressed fast food workers, or they're just oppressed fast food workers, period.
Yeah.
You find those on college campuses or on the main streets, the green streets around college campuses, as those students themselves work those same jobs
Yes.
to get by, to make a few dollars. They need some historical context. They need to understand that 40 years ago, you could work one of those part-time jobs for 20 hours a week and basically support yourself in a public college and not go into debt or into any serious debt. They need to understand what has changed since then, why college has gotten so expensive in the meantime, and that's a part of class conflict. That's a part of neoliberalism as it has evolved in the last 40 years, and that their education ought to be free.
Yeah,
Absolutely. But we shouldn't underestimate, I think, the force and effectiveness of the account that is being offered to people, particularly young people, college students, workers in fast food establishments and so forth, by the media environment they find themselves in.
Yeah.
That account needs constant critique. It needs a constant exposure, and that doesn't happen. That's not the job of American media. The American media is the other way around, and it's hardly to be a matter of surprise that it's effective. It works. It does very well. And we have to get out of that some way. We have to find some way for a discussion, for a critique, for an understanding of what the actual situation is, so that Americans don't look around and say, well, yes, this is being done to us by Wall Street, and these wars are not in our interest, but still we've got to vote for Hillary Clinton. Now that's a very real problem, and in terms of finding a way to break through that, we have a long, long way to go. You've been watching News from Neptune. This is a weekly program of discussion of these matters, and we invite your comments. We have a Facebook page, and I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com.
I'd like to say that in closing, that even though I seem agitated and I'm concerned that I've sounded perhaps even a bit shrill tonight, and I don't want to sound shrill.
There's a lot to be shrill about.
I'm a
Come
candidate. I'm dignified, for crying out loud. So, I'll try to sound less shrill next week.
My dignified discussants tonight have been David Green and Ron Zook. Our thanks to our directors and producer, Jason Yosef. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with Neptuner David Johnson, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere in CU. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.
you made me reach for my security blanket.
Unbearable.